Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. We started in on the intro to the Gospel of John last week, and we'll finish it this week. I just want to focus on one thing because there's a lot of reasons. Why is the Gospel of John so different? We talked about how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all pretty similar. They start out with the long Galilean ministry of Jesus, and then they proceed to his final journey to Jerusalem with the trial, the crucifixion, resurrection appearances, and so on. Why is John so different? John has several trips to Jerusalem. John does not focus quite as much on all the Galilean ministry stories, and he has Jerusalem stories instead. He's got the story of Lazarus and his raising from the dead, and there's all kinds of things in John, and there's theological language in John that's different. Well, for one thing, one of the reasons John seems so different is because the other three Gospels are dependent on each other. What scholars call literary dependence means you've actually got something you're reading and you're imitating it, maybe even quoting it. So it kind of makes it look like it's 3 against 1 here. You know, you've got 3 of these and 1 of the others. You've got apparently the Gospel of Mark being used by Matthew and Luke to some extent. And then scholars also notice there's some collection of stories that are in Matthew and Luke with very similar language, but not in Mark. And so they began to speculate, well, where did those stories come from? Well, they were mostly sayings, and it was very common for the students of a teacher to collect together the sayings of the teacher. And so they speculated that there was a sayings document in the early days of the church that wasn't a full gospel because it was just sayings. It didn't have any of the events. And that Matthew and Luke had both used that source. And since these were German scholars and the German word for source starts with a Q, they called it the Q document. It just means a source. But John did not directly use Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You don't see John quoting from them or so on. And so this makes John seem very different. But picture this. What if you had one super gospel that was kind of like a combination of Matthew and Luke, and then you had a second gospel of John? Well, then it would be 1 versus 1 instead of 3 versus 1. So you wouldn't say John is different any more than that other one's different. You know, they would both be different. John obviously had a purpose to do something different. That's one reason it's different. There was no point, once Matthew, Mark, and Luke already existed, for John to write yet another parallel or synoptic gospel, to have a fourth one. John had a purpose of giving us something different. And being independent and being determined to do something new, he can focus on different details of the same stories as well as different details of Jesus' ministry. Also, it's not just a matter of what did John do. What did Matthew, Mark, and Luke do? Mark, as we saw, was recording Peter's gospel preaching in Rome. Peter had a certain purpose in that gospel preaching. So Peter omitted certain stories, particularly the ones that might be hard to understand. If you're preaching the gospel, do you start out with the fundamentals and the things that are most easy to understand, or do you jump into confusing things and hard to understand things? Well, you're going to preach kind of the most important and easiest to understand aspects of the gospel if you're Peter preaching in Rome. And then if Matthew and Luke follow the outline of the Gospel of Mark, they're going to omit things also that don't really fit into their outline. And then John comes along and says, well, I'm not going to do another gospel just like those. So it's not just what John did, it's also what did they do? What did they omit? Because there are more stories than will fit in a document of this era. Documents were written on scrolls, and they made papyrus scrolls to be a certain length, and that's all they could do, all they were able to make. And if we look at ancient scroll records, the longest books in the New Testament, like Matthew, Luke, and Acts, are all about the limit of what a scroll was. And John says late in his gospel that there are so many stories that, all the scrolls in the world wouldn't hold them all. If you think about it, how long does it take to read out loud, let's say, an entire gospel? Maybe a few hours. But it's 3.5 years of ministry of Jesus. So obviously there's been some selection by everyone, not just John. There's been some selection of what was considered the most important things. So Peter has that framework, the Galilean ministry and the final trip to Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke follow that. But that doesn't mean that Jesus only visited Jerusalem one time, for example, at the end of his ministry. It means that Peter had a certain approach to the oral preaching of the gospel that set the tone for Mark's gospel and therefore for Matthew and Luke's. Peter wanted to record the fact that the bulk of the ministry of Jesus was in the Galilean area. That's where he did most of his teaching and his accompanying miracles. And that the big conflict with the Jewish leaders was primarily in Jerusalem. It was a little bit in Galilee, but it was primarily in Jerusalem. And so this made a good gospel sermon for Peter. Let's talk about Jesus. Focus on the Galilean ministry. And then let's move to his conflict with the Jewish authorities leading to his arrest and crucifixion and so on. And so that's a really good outline to follow. But there were some other trips to Jerusalem before the final one. And John records those trips. And they just don't really fit Peter's preaching outline and therefore Mark's outline. And that's one reason why the Gospel of John looks so different. Right? For example, early in John, there's a cleansing of the temple, driving out money changers. And then it happens again as a bookend late in his ministry. It makes sense, actually, when you look at the Gospel of John, Jews made pilgrimages to Jerusalem. There were certain festivals every year where Jews came to Jerusalem. And in your lifetime as a Jew, you made multiple trips to Jerusalem. And in 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry, it would actually be quite surprising if he only went to Jerusalem one time, because there were festivals 3 times a year that people made pilgrimages to. So when John records these trips to Jerusalem, it's entirely believable. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, by omitting them, were focusing on a certain Galilean ministry of Jesus. But that's not the same as Matthew, Mark, and Luke saying these trips never happened. They just omitted them. John decided to record these trips, including the famous early cleansing of the temple. Likewise, the raising of Lazarus. If you read that carefully, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, he then departs to the other side of the Jordan, comes back to Jericho. Only later does he come back. So it's not really part of the final trip to Jerusalem. So it doesn't really fit the gospel outline that Peter used, and which Mark followed, and Matthew and Luke. It's not the final trip to Jerusalem. John recognizes it's an important story, and he's going to break out of that outline. He's going to break out of that mold that the other three Gospels were in. John, can you give us more details in some of the cases? For example, in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus is being arrested, he says, I've been preaching in the temple over and over and over. I wasn't teaching in secret. I was in the temple courts teaching over and over. You didn't ever come arrest me then. You know, it's not like I was hiding. You knew where I was. You knew where I was teaching. But the funny thing is, if you look at the Gospel of Mark, you look at that statement, when was he teaching over and over in the temple courts? Well, because Peter has omitted preaching about these earlier trips to Jerusalem, they're not recorded. So it looks a little funny. In Mark, the only time you find him teaching in the temple courts is right before he's arrested, a few days before. But the way he speaks of it, even in Mark, is that wasn't the only time. That wasn't the only time Jesus taught in the temple. There were many times when he taught in the temple, according to his own words. John gives us details that piece together with the other Gospels and make sense out of it. Why did the Sanhedrin have to stop Jesus' trial and send him off to Pontius Pilate? They're accusing him of blasphemy, among other things. Why don't they just execute him? Well, John explains in chapter 18, in verse 31, so Pilate told them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your laws. Pilate doesn't care about this religious dispute. Blasphemy is no big deal, really, to the Roman official. It's not legal for us to put anyone to death, the Jews declared. So John tells us something that's omitted from the other Gospels, but it helps the other Gospels make sense, too. The Jews, under Roman law, were not allowed to put anyone to death. And furthermore, the Romans don't really care about the religious disputes of the Jews, and they're not going to put anybody to death for that reason. And so his accusers, his enemies, had to come up with a reason for the Romans to want to put him to death. And so that's when they start accusing him. He says he's a king. He says he's a king other than Caesar, and so on. Now that gets the Romans' attention. That sounds like a rebellion is starting. They had to change their accusation. He blasphemed our God, and Pilate's response is, sorry to hear it, but it's not really something I'm going to take care of. And you see this even in the lifetime of Paul in Acts, that when the Jews get stirred up and they drag Paul and his companions before the Roman authorities view it all as a dispute inside one religion, Judaism, and they don't have any desire to be the arbiters of such a thing. They don't care. That's not their job, is to arbitrate religious disputes. But there's one thing they do care about in Rome. If you're a Roman governor, if you're a Roman official, you had better maintain order. The word had better not get back to Rome that you can't handle your local situation and they're rioting and so on. And so one thing the Jews could always do, whether it's Jesus' case or Paul's case, start acting like you're about to riot, or actually start one. Now the Romans care. Their concern is not really justice. Their concern is order. Law and order is not the same thing as justice, right? If people are all about to riot because of this man Paul or this man Jesus, maybe we should just grab Jesus or Paul and punish them to pacify the mob. And the question of guilt or innocence is beside the point to a Roman official. Stopping the riot is the point. And so that's how the Jews could get it. But the Jews couldn't do the punishing on their own. They had to get the Romans to do it for them. And John explains that they had had their authority to execute taken away from them. And that wasn't true in every single place in the Roman Empire. Many local authorities chosen from among the conquered nation did still have the authority to carry out execution, but not the Jews, among others. Why is John so different? Well, for one thing, it seems obvious that John is trying to teach us in more depth. He's not going to write yet another Matthew, Mark, or Luke. We already have 3 of those. John is writing later. We discussed that last week, the evidence for that. The synoptic gospels, remember that synoptic just means parallel. They have the parallel stories, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The synoptic gospels have already covered all the fundamentals of the faith and of Jesus' teaching. So John doesn't have to go back over all that. His purpose, apparently, is to deal with things beyond that. And so he's going to use stories that are harder to understand in his gospel, and that's going to make his gospel look a lot different. For one thing, John relates a lot of inner circle teachings, private teachings that were not public, they were only to his apostles. And those include long sections of John. What's called the Farewell Discourse goes from John 13 through 17. It's got washing the disciples' feet, his private speech, I am the way and the truth and the life, and it goes right up through his prayer in the garden in John 17, which is mostly about his own followers. All of this is very private. All of this is very different from that Galilean ministry where he's teaching all the people a better understanding than they have previously been taught about things. This is inner circle teaching. And there's a lot of it in John. This is something I noticed when we started our Bible reading plan back in January, and I got to the Gospel of John, I marked in a certain color all the passages that were obviously not understood at the time they happened. And in John, in many cases, he explicitly says, we didn't understand until after he was resurrected. You know, John breaks in as a narrator and says, we didn't get this at the time. Lots of stories also of Jesus speaking to someone who doesn't understand, like Nicodemus in John chapter 3. So once again, it makes sense for Peter to preach the easiest to understand parts of the gospel, the fundamentals. John comes along later and says, I want to go deeper, and I want to talk about all the things that we didn't understand at the time they happened. And so there are more than 24 places in the Gospel of John where it explicitly says that someone did not understand what had happened or what Jesus had just said. And you can even go beyond that list where it doesn't explicitly say that someone didn't understand, but it's quite obvious. And so it's, there are more examples than there are chapters in John. This is all through John. Here's stuff that we didn't get at the time. Now it's time to explain them. John chapter 2. After he cleanses the temple early on in his ministry as an opening, that brings the question, who are you? Where do you get authority to do this kind of thing? And so Jesus has a conversation with these Jews, and in verse 18, it says, "So the Jews replied to him, 'What sign of authority will you show us for doing these things?' Jesus answered, 'Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days.' Therefore the Jews said, 'This temple took 46 years to build,' and they were still building it at the time. They were still finishing it off, really, at the time. 'And will you raise it up in 3 days?' And then here's John's comment. 'But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the statement Jesus had made.'" So this is just one of the earliest examples in John of explicitly saying, we didn't get it at the time, and 3 years later, we finally got it. There's the longest chapter in John, chapter 6. After the feeding of the 5,000, the crowds are gathered around him, and Jesus realizes they don't fully understand. They're just looking for a free meal. And so he begins to challenge them. "I'm the bread of life. Don't worry about that bread. Don't come asking for more of that bread. I'm the bread of life." And they don't understand. And he goes on and on deeper into the imagery that they don't understand. If you want to follow me, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And then a lot of the people in the crowd start saying, well, this is getting weird. I'm out of here. And at the end, Jesus says to his disciples, what about you? Are you going to leave too? If we look at John chapter 6, read a couple of verses here. Then the Jews started complaining about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They were saying, "Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" So that's the example of the crowd not understanding. And then we skip on down. At that, the Jews argued among themselves, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So Jesus has challenged them. And then finally in verse 60, "Therefore, when many of his disciples heard this, they said, 'This teaching is hard. Who can accept it?'" Now, the word disciples doesn't just mean the 12. There were a number of people who were following him around. They considered themselves to be disciples of this teacher. And it says that some of them gave up and left and stopped following. And that led in verse 66, from that moment, many of his disciples turned back and no longer accompanied him. Therefore, Jesus said to the 12, you don't want to go away too, do you? Simon Peter answered, Lord, who will we go to? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. It's not that Peter said we understand everything. The reason we're staying is because we understood all that bread of life discourse and eating your flesh and drinking your blood. I don't think they understood any of that really until later. It's just that Peter says, well, we're committed. Where else are we going to go? Who else has your teaching? But he doesn't indicate any real understanding of it. And Jesus replied to them, didn't I choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is the devil? And here's John's comment. He was referring to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, one of the 12, because he was going to betray him. That's a later comment. That's not something that John understood at the time. I'm sure it was very mysterious. One of you is the devil. What's he talking about? Well, it all becomes clear later. And there's a tremendous amount of this in the Gospel of John. We didn't understand, but later we figured it all out. And that's the kind of thing that John wants to teach. That's why John is writing this gospel, not to repeat Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but to say, here's the really difficult stuff that we didn't even understand until much later, until Jesus was crucified. In the farewell speech of Jesus, we also have direct indications we don't understand. After he says, I'm the way, you know where I may be, you know the way I'm going. Lord, Thomas said, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Which prompts the famous saying of Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then Philip, he says, if you know me, you'll know my Father. And Philip says, Lord, show us the Father. And that's enough for him. And he says, I've already shown you the Father. If you've understood my teaching, you've seen the Father. That was all mysterious to them. Then in verse 22 in chapter 14, after Jesus has said about revealing himself to them, Judas, not Iscariot, the one we often call Jude, said to him, Lord, how is it you're going to reveal yourself to us and not to the world? Well, the answer is basically in the resurrection appearances. Jesus is going to reveal himself to followers and not to the world. There's no public resurrection appearances like the old Galilean ministry, There's only appearances to those who are believers. But at the time, Jude can't possibly understand this. And so John includes that story. Later in chapter 16 of the discourse, a little while and you will no longer see me. Again, a little while and you will see me. Well, that's kind of a mysterious saying. He's saying, I'm going to go away, when I'm crucified, but then a little while after that, you'll see me again. But it's very cryptic language. Did they understand at the time? Well, of course not. Therefore, some of his disciples said to one another, what is this he tells us? A little while, and you will not see me. Again, a little while, and you will see me. And earlier, because I'm going to the Father, they said, what is this he's saying? A little while? We don't know what he's talking about. So, this would not really be the best kind of example of the teaching of Jesus when you're Peter and you're preaching to Gentiles who know nothing of the Bible and know nothing of Jesus and hearing about Jesus for the first time. But if you're John and you're writing to Christians who already know all the fundamentals and all the most common stories, and you want to go deeper with those Christians, then you can start teaching the things that were hard to understand. But in an oral teaching, in a sermon in Rome for Peter, this is not the kind of story you want to include. You just don't want to mystify your audience. Some of the differences of Gospels are based on who were they written to. Mark has that flavor of Peter preaching to Gentiles. Matthew has the flavor of preaching to Jews. And Luke kind of has the flavor of preaching to both. But one thing that makes John a little different is that later in the first century, when he's writing, after the temple has been destroyed and the Jews have been scattered once again, the Jews are really mixed in with the Greeks, and they're referred to by historians as Hellenistic Jews. They're Jews who have picked up a lot of Greek, not just language, but custom. And so John has this flavor of the Hellenistic audience. In a Hellenistic audience that includes Gentiles, there are some stories that might not be understood very well, and we see John omitting them. For example, in the Greco-Roman world, they had stories of exorcisms of demons, of spirits. But in their view, it was like a black magic operation to exorcise a demon. Now, that's going to be confusing if John were to relate the exorcism stories that we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke to his audience late in the first century. What does that communicate? That Jesus is engaged in black magic or something? So what you notice, and you might not have noticed this before, there are no exorcism stories in the Gospel of John. They're all omitted. You can already find them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John doesn't include them. They don't suit his audience very well. Parables. John basically has no parables. Another really distinctive thing about the Gospel of John. Rabbis taught a lot in parables, but Greek teachers really didn't. Okay. So they would not be easily understandable without explaining to them, this is a whole different kind of story. It's called a parable, and it's not literal, and so on. For Jews, this is nothing. You know, they're used to that. They've had parables before from rabbis. So it's no big deal for them to hear a parable and understand it. But for John's audience, a parable would not be understandable. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are up in double digits, each of them in number of parables. We mentioned last time there are 40 parables that are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 28 of them in Luke alone, but 22, I think, in Matthew, and 15 or something like that in Mark. 0 in John. Why such a difference? It's a different audience. It's an audience that doesn't really understand parables. So, John is useful to us because it's so different. If John was trying to teach the difficult to understand things and the deeper teachings and the mysteries that they didn't understand until after the resurrection, because he wanted the Christians of the late first century to go deeper, then that means it's very valuable for us to go deeper in our understanding. but it's also not necessarily the first one you start with. And especially if you're teaching someone else about the gospel for the first time, I'm not sure that it's what you start with. You know, it's intended for a little different audience than that.
Well, John and Peter both were constant companions of Jesus, but wouldn't you say that John had a spiritual intelligence that the others didn't have?
The early Christians said, one of the early Christians said that basically because all of the facts had already been presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John wrote a spiritual gospel. It's a very spiritual and theological gospel. And Revelation. And there's a lot of theology. If in 1 John, there's quite a bit of higher level thinking in a way that you see. The character comes out in all 5 books that are credited to John. You see this commonality of the author, the language, the theology, the spirituality of it. John probably was about the youngest of the 12, and he lived the longest as a result. He saw the most, and he's still writing about 90 AD, so he's got the most experience with the Christian community and knows most what do they need in order to move on and to move deeper. That's what the Gospel of John is. Whereas the Gospel of Mark is really kind of the classic case of if you were teaching the gospel to somebody who's not from a church background and you want to start out, the Gospel of Mark is really perfect because that's what Peter was doing. Preaching to people who had no Old Testament knowledge, no anything. Alternating between the miracles of Jesus to establish his divinity and his credibility, and then teachings, and then some more miracles, and then teaching. That's a great presentation that we find in the Gospel of Mark. And John is a completely different approach because those others already existed. So, thank you much for your time.